everyone, and welcome. This presentation is titled Deaf Awareness Month, Exploring Deaf Culture Through Books. Thank you all for being here. My name is Casey Lundgren, and I am one of the staff American Sign Language interpreters in the Disability Equity Office. I love reading, so I hope you're all as excited as I am to talk about books. Here's our agenda for the day. I'll be highlighting books in the following categories. We'll start with picture books, then we'll move on to early readers and teen books, and then we'll end with adult books. Within the adult book category, I'll be showcasing books in the following genres: fiction, horror, poetry, romantasy, nonfiction, and then autobiography/memoir. My goal was to have a wide range of books, so hopefully there'll be something for everyone. All right, before we get started today, I would like to take a few moments to go over some terminology that's used in this workshop. We'll start with capital D deaf, which is abbreviated with a capital D, and this does not equate to a specific degree of hearing loss, but a cultural identity indicating belonging to the deaf community. This is usually the preferred term when referring to members of the deaf community. Next, we have deaf with a lowercase d, and this refers to a specific degree of hearing loss, which is usually profound. Next, we have hard of hearing, which is abbreviated with a capital H, and this refers to a degree of hearing loss, which usually ranges from mild to severe. Lastly, we have deaf blind with a capital D and a capital B. This is abbreviated capital D, capital B. And similarly, this refers to a cultural identity and indicates being a part of the deaf-blind community. Next, we have deaf-blind with lowercase d and lowercase b following the pattern. This refers to a specific degree of hearing and vision loss, which is profound and significant. Lastly, we have American Sign Language, which is abbreviated ASL. And this is a non-spoken language used by many deaf and hard of hearing people that is used primarily in the United States. September is Deaf Awareness Month, and Deaf Awareness Month is a time to learn more about the deaf community, including its culture, history, language, and the continued advocacy for increased access. There are many ways to participate in Deaf Awareness Month, but as I mentioned, I love reading, and so a great way to participate is to read about these topics or support deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind authors by checking out their books. The book list I'll be going over today is non-exhaustive. There are many more great books and authors out there. It was actually hard to pick just a few to talk about today. Also, as a note, some books may have problematic tropes, or may be written by authors who have limited connections with the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities. I've tried to note these throughout the presentation if it is applicable. All right, let's get started. Bring on the books. So the first category is picture books, and I'll be highlighting 4 books in this category. The first book is this really cool book called Colorful Ocean by Laura Bloom. Laura is a certified American Sign Language interpreter, and she also has a degree in early childhood education. The illustrator is a deaf artist named Lawrence Laskowski, and this book is designed for all babies. Each page has a colorful illustration of a sea animal in a specific color. And none of the books I'll talk to you about today require you to know ASL, but if you do know ASL, this book is especially cool because this book rhymes when you sign it. Many children's books rhyme because it's fun to read and it's fun for kids to listen to. It helps babies and children learn language. Those rhymes, unfortunately, are usually lost when interpreted into ASL. And this series, there are 3 books so far, are the only books that are designed to rhyme in sign. So how that works is that each animal and each color uses the same hand shape, which creates a visual rhyme and helps deaf babies to learn language. If you get these books and you want to learn how to sign them, they each come with a link to a video that has a deaf mentor signing the book for anyone to follow along with. It was published in 2020, And I know that book ratings are very important to some people, so this book has a 5 out of 5-star rating on Goodreads. Amazing. Okay, caveat. There are only 2 reviews, and I'm one of them. All right, this next book is called Freddie and the Fairy by Julia Donaldson. If you're familiar with children's books, you might recognize that name. She's a popular children's book author, most well known for her books The Gruffalo and Room on the Broom. I'm partial to Room on the Broom. She was also the 2011-2012 Children's Laureate. She is hard of hearing and wears hearing aids. And this book is about a hard of hearing fairy who tries to grant a boy's wish. However, the boy keeps mumbling and covering his mouth, which leads to funny miscommunications. This book teaches best practices for clear communication, which includes speaking clearly, facing the person you're talking to, and not covering your mouth. It was published in 2010 and has a 3.95-star rating on Goodreads. Julia Donaldson said after she published this book, she received quite a few letters from children who wear hearing aids saying that they loved seeing a fairy with hearing aids. It's very cute. All right, this next book is called The William Hoy Story, How a Deaf Baseball Player Changed the Game. The author is Nancy Chernin, who, as far as I know, doesn't have any connections to the deaf community. She's written a lot of books about various people who've had a positive impact on the world. This book introduces readers to William Hoy, who was one of the first deaf professional baseball players. He played in the late 1800s and was a very talented outfielder and base runner. He's also credited with establishing the signs umpires still use today. For example, pictured on the slide here is the cover of the book. William Hoy is sliding into the base, and the base umpire has flung both of his arms straight out and away from his body. In baseball, that's the sign for safe, and William Hoy invented that sign. This is a fun bit of deaf history and a famous deaf athlete to learn about. This book was published in 2016 and has 4.42 stars on Goodreads. All right, this is the last picture book I'll be talking about. It's titled The Sound of Silence, Growing Up Hearing with Deaf Parents. The author is Myron Ulberg, who is a CODA, or a child of deaf adults. That means that Myron is hearing, and both of his parents were deaf. CODAs are a unique group, since as I mentioned, they're born hearing, but they often grow up with ASL as their first language. This picture book is an adaptation of Myron's memoir, which is called Hands of My Father. Myron grew up at a time when deaf people were often dismissed as incapable, and ASL was not as well recognized. Myron, as a hearing child who knew English and ASL, was often the intermediary between his deaf parents and the hearing world. I just want to add that as interpreters, we have to read a lot of books in our interpreter training programs. And Katrina, our interpreter today, said Hands of My Father was one that stood out to her. She remembered really liking it. I admit I haven't read it yet, but now it's on my to-read list. This picture book adaptation was published in 2019 and has a Goodreads score of 4.23 stars. All right, now let's move on to early readers. Early readers are books designed for children who are just starting to read independently on their own. I'll be highlighting 2 books in this category. This first book is an example from a series called Emma Every Day by C.L. Reed. C.L. Reed is deafblind, has a cochlear implant, and uses ASL. She has 3 sons, and the middle son is also deafblind. These stories are about the everyday adventures of Emma, who is deaf and, like C.L. Reed, has a cochlear implant and uses ASL. They're very sweet, simple stories about things like friendship, school, soccer, and in the case of the book cover pictured on this slide, cats. The cover here depicts Emma, a young girl with her cochlear implant visible over her left ear, holding an orange cat. At the top of the book cover is the title Emma, and underneath that in smaller letters is the rest of the title, Every Day. But above the words Emma are the handshapes in ASL for the letters EMMA. And that's a nod to one thing this book emphasizes, which is fingerspelling. Each of these books has the alphabet in ASL, also called a fingerspelling chart, inside. And then throughout the book, every other page, it will have one word that's written in the story. It's usually bolded. And then next to that word will be the handshapes used to spell that word in ASL. It's a very simple, fun way of encouraging fingerspelling practice. The first book in this series was published in 2020, and it has a 3.5-star rating on Goodreads. All right. El Depo was written by C.C. Bell, who is hard of hearing and wears hearing aids. She wrote and illustrated this graphic novel based on her own childhood experiences. C.C. lost her hearing as a young child and subsequently had to start wearing hearing aids. Unfortunately, she grew up when hearing aid technology was not as advanced as it is today. So when she went to school, it not only consisted of the earpieces we think of today, which were much bigger and bulkier back then, but also this chest piece that was connected to the earpieces by small wires. And the chest piece was a large plastic box that was held on by shoulder straps. It was worn sort of like a reverse backpack. Pictured on the slide is the cover of the book, where Cece illustrated herself wearing this equipment. Cece drew herself as a bunny. All of the characters in the book are drawn as bunny people. And she's flying through the air in a Superman-like pose with a red cape. She's wearing a white undershirt and the chest piece is strapped on top. One of her earpieces is actually flying through the air, and the wire that connects the earpiece to the chest piece is what creates the writing of the title. Now, not many kids would ever want to wear something like that and be so noticeably different, so she struggled. This book is about how she began to think of her hearing aids and chest piece as superhero equipment. Batman has his utility belt with all his gadgets on it, right? Well, this was her superhero equipment. And she begins to imagine herself as this superhero called El Defo. It's another really cute and funny story. The author very creatively utilizes the graphic novel format and speech bubbles to give readers an idea of what her own experiences with sound, speech, and hearing aids is like. It won a John Newbery Medal in 2015 and was also made into an animated TV series on Apple TV in 2022. I put it in the early reading section because it is a graphic novel, so it has lots of illustrations to support the reading, but the text and the storyline are more for an 8 to 10-year-old. It was published in 2014 and has a 4.2-star rating on Goodreads. All right, now I'm going to talk about 3 teen novels. This first book is called Wonderstruck by Brian Selznick. Brian is hearing, and as far as I know, doesn't have any connections with the deaf community. However, I will mention on the next slide how he was an ally to someone in the deaf community. Now, Brian Selznick is most famous for his other book, which is titled The Invention of Hugo Cabret. But this book, Wonderstruck, was also quite popular. It was popular enough that it was also made into a movie. Wonderstruck is a really cool book that intertwines 2 stories that are set 50 years apart. One story is told in words and follows Ben, who's searching for his father after losing his hearing. Ben was born deaf in one ear, but then loses his hearing in the other ear after he gets struck by lightning through a telephone. The other story is told entirely in pictures and depicts Rose, a deaf girl who runs away to New York City. The 2 storylines gradually converge and create this tale of family, belonging, and connection. What's nice is the characters in the book use a variety of ways to communicate. There's writing, there's speaking, there's signing, and that's very reflective of the diversity of communication styles in the deaf community in real life. This book did receive some criticism, as it does have aspects of a hearing savior, and it was also criticized for its portrayal of deaf blindness. However, there are still a lot of positive aspects of the book, and it was overall well received by the community. It's a massive book at 640 pages, But about half of the pages are full-page illustrations for Rose's storyline, so it goes by pretty quickly. As I said, this book was made into a movie, and I want to mention that because the movie launched the career of Millicent Simmons, a now famous deaf actress. She was cast as Rose, the deaf character who runs away to New York, and it kickstarted her movie career. After Wonderstruck, she was cast in A Quiet Place and then the A Quiet Place sequel. Those are horror films if you're unfamiliar. She was really good in those too. But the movie version of Wonderstruck was quite important for that reason as well. Now, Wonderstruck, the book, was published in 2011 and has a 4.2 star rating on Goodreads. All right, this next book is called Show Me a Sign and is written by Anne Claire Lizotte, who is deaf and uses ASL. This is a historical novel set in the early 19th century Martha's Vineyard, where a high population of deaf residents led to a unique community where almost everyone knew sign language. The story follows Mary Lambert, a young deaf girl, as she navigates the challenges and prejudices that arise when an outsider, a quote-unquote scientist who is studying the deafness, arrives in her close-knit town and eventually decides to kidnap her for his research. The writing in this book I thought was a little simplistic, but the message is powerful. Also, this book is a really neat way to learn some deaf history. Martha's Vineyard is a real place and was extremely important to the development of ASL and the deaf community here in the United States. This book is part of a trilogy, and parts of the other two books also showcase some other famous history tidbits. What's neat is that in the back of this book, the author included some historical notes about the history and the language, but then she also had a thank you to Brian Selznick, who was just on the previous slide as the author of Wonderstruck. Anne mentions that she read Wonderstruck and loved it, loved its portrayal of deaf culture. She was writing her book at the time, and she reached out to Brian for help in getting her book published. Brian connected her with his publisher, and then the rest is history. Anne was able to publish her books. So what a really neat connection. This book was published in 2020 and has a 4-star rating on Goodreads. Okay, this next book is called Song for a Whale. It was written by Lynn Kelly, who's a hearing special education teacher and sign language interpreter. Whew, this book pulls on the heartstrings. I was tearing up at the end, but in a good way. It's a moving novel about Iris, a 12-year-old deaf girl who feels isolated both at school and at home. She learns about Blue 55, a whale who cannot communicate with other whales because he sings at a different frequency. Iris uses her knowledge of sound and technology to craft a song that Blue 55 can hear. The book has themes of belonging and communication. When I read this book, I just thought, wow, this is written by someone who truly has worked in the public school system with deaf children. Many of the characters introduced felt like students and people that I had met in my own career. I specifically wanted to include this book because it gives a very realistic portrayal of a mainstreamed deaf experience. Mainstream means when a deaf child goes to a public school and receives their education through an interpreter. They are often the only deaf child in the entire school. Alternatively, deaf children can go to a school for the deaf, which is called a residential school. And there, usually all of the instruction, all of the communication is in ASL. Everyone signs. I'll mention books with that perspective later in this presentation. I think there's one next. But in this book, Song for a Whale, Iris and her interpreter are basically the only two people in the entire school who can communicate in ASL. It's a very different experience. This book was published in 2019 and has a Goodreads score of 4.23 stars. All right. That brings us to the adult books. I'm going to start with fiction, and I have one book to highlight here. True Biz was written by Sarah Novick in 2023. Sarah is deaf. She was raised orally, which means a focus on speech therapy and lip reading, but she now uses ASL. True Biz The words true biz are an idiom in ASL, and it means seriously or real talk. This book takes place at the River Valley School for the Deaf, which is a fictionalized residential school for the deaf. Residential schools for the deaf are, as I just mentioned, that other type of school. So here, everyone in the school uses sign language to communicate. And the story follows three characters. First, there's Charlie, a deaf teenager struggling to fit in as she learns ASL for the first time. Then there's Austin, a deaf teenager from a multi-generational deaf family. And lastly, there's February, the school's principal, who is also a CODA, which is a child of deaf adults. Through each character, the novel explores issues of communication, identity, and the fight for rights. This book does have content warnings. There is violence and graphic and explicit imagery. It's a realistic novel that doesn't shy away from the gritty, less pleasant, maybe less discussed aspects of deaf culture, hence the title, meaning real talk. This book got a lot of traction when Reese Witherspoon picked it for her own book club. It's a great book, and it really gives readers a window into deaf culture, life in a residential school, and other interesting tidbits like the mention of Black ASL. It was published in 2023, and it has a 4.06 star rating on Goodreads. All right, the next genre is horror. I've got one book to talk about. This book is The Stand by Stephen King. Stephen King is actually deaf in one ear. The Stand is a post-apocalyptic epic that follows the aftermath of a deadly pandemic that wipes out most of the world's population. I understand if The Stand may be a little too real after what we've all been through with COVID. However, this book wasn't actually inspired by recent events. Stephen King wrote this in 1978. Anyway, the survivors of this pandemic form opposing communities. One survivor, Nick Andros, is deaf and communicates by lip reading and writing. Nick becomes one of the leaders on the side of light, and his deafness plays a role in how he views the world. The ultimate confrontation between the two groups of survivors determines the fate of humanity, very good versus evil. Now, this is a Stephen King novel, so there are definite content warnings. There's lots of death and violence and other explicit imagery and disturbing content. The Stand was adapted into a miniseries on CBS in 2020. Now, that timing was a bit unfortunate, or possibly exceptionally timely, depending how you look at it. However, the network cast a hearing actor as Nick, and that sparked outrage and protests from the deaf community. Many boycotted the series and vowed to never watch it. The Stand is another hefty novel. It comes in at 1,152 pages and has a 4.35 star rating on Goodreads. The next genre is poetry, and I have one book to highlight. This book is called Deaf Republic and was written by Ilya Kaminsky, who is an acclaimed Ukrainian-American deaf poet. Ilya wears hearing aids and does not use ASL. Deaf Republic is a collection of poems that all together tell an overarching story about an occupied town in a time of political unrest. Soldiers shoot and kill a deaf child when he doesn't respond to their commands. The gunshot becomes the last thing the city hears as the entire population goes deaf. They begin to coordinate a resistance using sign language. Deaf Republic is a somber, poetic exploration of silence, resistance, and communication. This book also has content warnings. As I just mentioned in the synopsis, there is violence and explicit imagery. Ilya was actually a UM visiting writer in the English department in the spring of 2025. I was lucky enough to get my copy of Deaf Republic signed then. Deaf Republic was published in 2019 and has a 4.39 star rating on Goodreads. The next genre is Romantasy, which, if you're unfamiliar with the term, is a fantasy romance. Romantasies are actually the fastest growing genre at the moment, I currently have one book in this category, but hopefully as the genre continues to grow, there will be more. The Witch Collector is the first book in the Witch Walker series written by Sharissa Weeks. Sharissa is hearing. Her mom was a special education teacher and learned ASL when Sharissa was around 10. Sharissa has mentioned on her website wanting to relearn ASL after finishing this series. We'll see. The book series is about Raina Bloodgood, a witch with hidden abilities. Her village lives in fear of the Witch Collector, who comes once a year and takes a witch from the village to serve the Frost King. After Raina's sister is chosen, Raina vows revenge. This book also has content warnings for violence and explicit imagery. Raina is an interesting character, though. She can hear, but she cannot speak, so she uses sign language. The author has notes in both in the book and on her website that she intentionally never refers to Raina as mute. As an author who has a platform through these books, she feels it's part of her responsibility to educate audiences that the word mute has been used in derogatory ways towards non-speaking people, and especially towards members of the deaf community. It's often used as a label that's meant to other those communities and has been used as a slur. She also emphasizes that the term is incorrect, as Raina, as well as all those who use sign language, can communicate. I found that to be quite commendable. In the book, there were also moments where characters grabbed Raina's hands to prevent her from communicating, from using sign language, which is a big taboo in the deaf community. Other characters in the book responded appropriately. It was neat to see that awareness and little inclusion of deaf culture. The Witch Collector was published in 2021, and she's already published book 2 and 3 in the series. There's 2 remaining books, which will conclude the series. Those haven't been published yet. She's working on it. But the first book has a rating of 3.74 stars on Goodreads. Next, I'll be talking about 2 nonfiction books. The first book is Seeing Voices by Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks he passed away, a hearing neuroscientist. When he set out to write this book, he began learning ASL and meeting with members of the deaf community, and he continued to try and learn ASL until he died. I've really enjoyed everything Oliver Sacks wrote. He's most famous for his book titled The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which is another very interesting book. However, Seeing Voices, this book, is one of my favorites. It combines neuroscience and linguistics with personal stories to explore the world of the deaf community. He focuses on history, culture, and language of the deaf. Dr. Sacks examines how sign language shapes identity and thought, as well as discussing the challenges and triumphs of deaf people and highlighting the importance of deaf culture and communication. Dr. Sacks does a great job of introducing readers to this wonderful community. I loved the little neuroscience aspects. For example, he talks about how language is actually processed in some different areas of the brain for deaf people because the language is visual compared to auditory. I think that's really cool. This book was published in 2000 and has a 4.06 rating on Goodreads. This second book is called Signing with Kai by Kiana Tate, who is a deaf entrepreneur from Detroit, Michigan. So she's a local Michigander. Kai was frustrated by the fact that none of the sign language books she saw had models inside that looked like her. So when she was in high school, she wrote and published this book. It's a very simple book going over the alphabet in ASL, that fingerspelling chart I mentioned earlier. But each letter is demonstrated by a person of color. It's a great little book showing diversity within the deaf community. It was published in 2021 and has a 5-star rating on Goodreads. Okay, there's only one review and it was me, but still. That brings us to our final category, which is autobiography/memoir. I have 4 books to highlight here. I'll say that this category was the hardest to pick only a few. There's so many great ones out there. The first book is The Story of My Life by Helen Keller. Helen Keller was a deafblind author. disability rights advocate, political activist, and leader. There are many books written about Helen Keller, but I picked this one because she wrote it. She wrote this autobiography in her early 20s. Keller describes her world before and after the breakthrough moment with her dedicated teacher, Anne Sullivan. She talks about how she began to understand language, her educational experiences, and her personal growth. This book is great to learn more about a famous deafblind historical figure and read about her own experiences. It was published in 1903 and has a Goodreads score of 4.08 stars. The next book is I'll Scream Later by Marlee Matlin. Marlee Matlin is a deaf actress, activist, and author. This memoir details Marlee Matlin's life as a deaf woman in Hollywood. The book covers her childhood, her breakthrough Oscar-winning role in Children of a Lesser God, and her personal struggles with addiction and abusive relationships. Matlin shares her journey of overcoming obstacles, finding her voice, and advocating for disability representation. Marlee is a contemporary deaf leader and has been a Hollywood trailblazer since the 80s. A documentary was also recently made called Marlee Matlin, Not Alone Anymore, which was released in 2025. Her book has a rating of 3.61 stars on Goodreads. The next memoir is Deaf Utopia, a memoir and a love letter to a way of life by Niall DeMarco. Niall DeMarco is a contemporary deaf leader. He's a deaf author, model, actor, producer, and activist. You may recognize him from when he won America's Next Top Model, or maybe you recognize him from when he won Dancing with the Stars. This memoir shares DeMarco's experiences growing up in a multi-generational deaf family and embracing deaf culture and American Sign Language. The book details his journey to fame as a model and activist, highlighting the joys, challenges, and misconceptions about deafness. He advocates for inclusion and accessibility while celebrating deaf identity. This is another book that provides a window into a residential school for the deaf experience. Niall DeMarco is a huge advocate for deaf education, so he does go into detail about his own educational experiences in both the residential school for the deaf and a mainstream or public school setting. Another interesting note about this book is that Niall's first language is ASL. So when he decided he wanted to write this book, he wanted to write it in ASL. Currently, ASL does not have a written form. So what he did was that he recorded himself signing this entire book, the drafts and edits recorded in ASL. And then he and his friend Robert Siebert translated the recordings into English to publish this book. When I was reading it, I felt like the flow of the stories and the language had that definite ASL influence. This book was published in 2022 and has a rating of 4.25 stars on Goodreads. The last book I'll be talking about today is Haben, the Deafblind Woman Who Conquered Harvard Law by Haben Girma. Haben Girma is a deafblind lawyer, author, and disability rights advocate. This memoir recounts Haben's experiences growing up as the daughter of Eritrean immigrants, navigating life as a deafblind person, and overcoming barriers to become the first deafblind graduate of Harvard Law. This book highlights her advocacy for disability rights and her determination to build a more inclusive world. It's a fantastic read. Haben is a contemporary deafblind leader, and I would encourage everyone to check out her book. It was published in 2019 and has a rating of 4.19 stars on Goodreads. All right, that was the last book, so now it's time to close. So again, books are a great way to learn about and support the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities. Hopefully, I've been able to demonstrate that there are books in many different genres. However, as I said, there are many, many more books and authors out there. So happy reading. And with that, thank you so much.